Thank you so much for completing the survey. I really do appreciate it. As a thank you to you and as promised, here's my presentation that I deliver around the world specifically for you as a thank you for completing and assisting in my PhD research. My presentation today is entitled Unraveling the Abyss because it's so important for us to understand what is in the darkness, what is in that nothingness, so we can start to create the futures that we want for ourselves and our companies. So, in case you hadn't realized, this is myself. If you were to Google, you'd see craigwing.com. That's my website over there. But on the right-hand side, you'll see there's another Craig Wing. He's a rugby player. Now, this is not me, as you can see, and I'm certainly not taking my top off. It is a winter's day, and I'm certainly going to be doing that to you. But instead, I was going to be sharing a presentation to you regarding some of the forces changing our future, and I started this very strange anecdote. Why? Because a couple of years ago, this Craig Wing made his debut. He would have become Japan's oldest rugby debutant at the Rugby World Cup, not the one where we won, but the one prior to that in South Africa, where South Africa played against Japan and Japan beat them. But this Craig Wing was injured in the warm-up in that game itself. What is fascinating though is as we discuss some of these forces is to realize that a couple of years ago we connected via LinkedIn. So it says there, nice to meet you buddy, keep seeing you around, hope life's good over on your side of the world. And the reason why I start this presentation around the forces shaping our future is in this crazy world that we're in right now, where Craig Wing 1 and Craig Wing 2 meet. This is all done through digitization, the effect of the internet. And you may know about the theory of 6 degrees of separation. Well, in a world underpinned by social media, by platform economics, by things such as LinkedIn, by Facebook, by Twitter, by Instagram, by Snapchat, and so on and so forth, all of these different social media pieces and tools mean that it's no longer just 6 degrees of separation, but it's 3.2 degrees of separation, which means everything that we do is not only faster, but it's more transparent, and what used to take 100 hours now takes 100 seconds. And that is the speed that's a result of one of these major forces affecting our lives today. But as myself, let me give you a bit of an introduction. So as you can see, I'm Chinese in origin, of Chinese extraction, and my grandparents came to South Africa during the Second World War. So there's a picture of my mom. She's a little girl in the center of the picture over there. And that picture was taken in 1960, 61 years ago, at the Rand Easter Show when it was still held at Wits University. But the story is not about my mom. The story is about my grandparents, my grandfather, my grandmother. And the stories of my grandfather was very well to do in China. He was upper class. He was almost like royalty. And he was kidnapped by the Japanese during the Second World War, who held him ransom and said, we know you've got a lot of money and we demand that you pay us out. And he said, look, we don't have money, we really don't. And they said, no, we do have it. And over the course of 2 weeks, they tried to ensure that they were going to get some kind of ransom, but he stuck to his guns and said, we really don't have anything, because they didn't. But over the course of those period of time, he befriended the maidservant. And he said to the maidservant, listen, there's this amazing place called Johannesburg in this newly discovered country, shall we say, called South Africa. And in Johannesburg, because as you know, it's built on a gold vein, in Johannesburg, there's so much gold, you can walk down the street and just pick up lumps of gold. And I will send it as payment for my ransom. She said no, but obviously my grandfather is a very charming and inspirational character, and he convinced her to set him free. The two of them fled, they got onto a boat, it took them another 3 months. They got all the way to Durban Harbour, and that's how they ended up getting into South Africa, where they ended up getting married. And so that's a story of my grandfather and my grandmother. But think about the story in the context of today if we had a cell phone. Because what we could have done is, just through the use of technology, we could have identified where my grandfather was by identifying where his cell phone was using GPS coordination, maybe using triangulation in his mobile device, or maybe even on the outside using some kind of surveillance capitalism, if you will. In South Africa, that would be the Vumatel cameras. Or perhaps even just simply put, we could see where the Uber vehicle dropped him off, or maybe the kidnappers had used Uber Eats. But the world is fundamentally differently because of technology, because of cell phones and how they've changed things. And if you think about this story, and if I was telling my grandparents a story 61 years ago, and if I could have said to them, Grandma, Grandpa, you know, in 61 years from now, in the future, it would be easier for me to present to people around the world than it would be to go to my neighbor to get a cup of sugar. They would have laughed at me and said, that's not possible. But in the blink of 2 generations, that's exactly what's happened, right? And so keep that in mind around the speed of response of how quickly technology changes things. Because ultimately my presentation is geared as such, is I'm not here to give you answers, right? I'm rather here to give you some of the questions. And Richard Feynman says it best. He says, I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. So at the end of my short presentation, if you have a lot more questions than you have answered, then I'm certainly done the right thing. Okay? So let's have a look at this. What am I going to be touching on today? I'll be talking about complexity and just decoding some of those elements of complexity in the world today in 2021. I'll be talking on the technology stack, some of the technologies that are driving the world we are today, and finally just some of the business interfaces and some of how that's now affecting us in business and in our lives and individually across the board. So let's get started around decoding complexity. The first is this incredible quote by a guy called Alvin Toffler, futurist, the author of Future Shock. And he says the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read or write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. Those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And that is such a powerful statement because many of us today are in a workplace, we're in a situation where we've done very, very well for ourselves, right? And we know the process, we know how to run a business, perhaps we know how to run a department, we know how to run teams, and we're very, very, very successful at what we do. But the world is changing, as you'll see shortly through the course of my presentation, and it's not necessarily always the ability to relearn, but it's the ability to unlearn first. How do we unlearn some of these things that got us to be successful, but we need to relearn them, right? And that's really the challenge. How do we learn, unlearn, and relearn? And why do we do this? Well, for most of us, business is very interesting. We tend to say when we go into some kind of planning process, what is the lens of our future? And we tend to say, well, what have we done in the past? What have we done over the last 5-10 years, and how do we extrapolate them into the future? So if we were selling cell phones, let's say we're a new cell phone manufacturer, we'd say something like, well, we sold so many units last year and so many units the year before. We've grown at, let's say, 10% over the last 3 years. We'll carry on growing at 10%. We have these kinds of manufacturing lines, and we'll carry on growing these kinds of manufacturing lines. We've got this kind of product, we see these kinds of trends coming through, we'll follow those. We've got this many people in our workforce, and we'll carry on growing by that. Or you may say something different, like our top revenue number is X number of million, and we're going to contribute and carry on growing by X% plus, right? But it's very much a extrapolation of the past. The problem is this is very much like driving a car in reverse. You tend to say where we're going by looking backwards in where we came from. Rather, it's about saying, what does the world look like tomorrow? How do we think about the future? How do we think about where the world is? And then how do we extrapolate that back into the present day? And as you saw just through the course of my research, that's what this research proposal is all about, rather my research is all about. It's about understanding where's the world going and what's the future look like, and how do we extrapolate that backwards from the future to create the kind of business we want. So it's about driving the car looking forwards, not looking backwards, right? And it's very much about understanding that process of backcasting, which is what my PhD is in. Why do we do that? Well, the great philosopher Mike Tyson says it best. He says, everyone has a plan till they get punched in the mouth. And really, if 2020 has taught us anything, it's that we can't plan much. The world is fundamentally different. There's a number of different forces that change the way which we think about the world. And these may not just be grand things like COVID-19, as you know about, but it may be things like changing consumer behavior. It may be a change in technology. It may be something as simple as a disruption in our distribution chain. Think about the Suez Canal and how that boat that was stuck there affected world supply chains. Think about the oil price. But the bottom line is this, the world is changing exponentially quickly. And as much as we try to change and try to predict things, you can never predict. It's about understanding how do we anticipate the future. And so it's exactly like this. How do we ensure that we have a plan, but that plan gets punched in the face, right? But rather, how do we change and how do we weave and how do we nimble? And for that, we just have to think back to 2020. What a year it was. And think about some of those changes and where we are today in 2021 and how unprepared we were for some of those changes. So let's reflect back in terms of what happened in 2020 by saying what actually happened. question, what will you do in 2021 and beyond if we think about 2020 and how really there were so many changes that we weren't prepared for? And so my hope is through the course of this presentation to share some of those things for you to think about things differently by starting with some of the technologies that are driving the world today. So to start that, we have to use this, I'm going to use this term called the fourth industrial revolution that I'm sure you've heard of several times. The fourth industrial revolution implies that there were three previous revolutions started in 1765 with the first revolution, which was led by the steam engine, 1870 by mass production, the second revolution, 1970 is approximately the third revolution, order of production, and today the fourth industrial revolution. The trick is, what is this definition? And we hear this all the time, the fourth industrial revolution. Well, the term was coined by Charles Schwab at the World Economic Forum a couple of years ago, but he actually took it from an economist previous to that. But this is typically what he says, and this is typically the accepted definition of the fourth industrial revolution. It's the fusion of new technology, specifically the merging of the physical, digital, and biological realms. That's typically what people tend to understand when we talk about the fourth industrial revolution. The problem is this is very much around technology only. This is the what. There is something beyond the what, and this is the how, which are some of the business models that are changing the world today, right? And some of these are exponentials that we talk about. It's about the experience economy, and it's about sharing. But it's not just the what and the how, it's also the why. And this is the piece, and this is the expanded definition that a lot of people do not talk about, and they don't understand why this is so pivotal today. And some of these higher order value systems are, it's a move towards customer first. It's a move beyond capitalism. It's about inclusivity. It's about saying there's more than enough for all of us. And finally, it's a piece around humanness. Now, in today's short presentation, I'm only going to be talking about the fusion of new technologies and these innovative business models. But please do keep in mind that the expanded definition talks about the why, how, and what, and the most important here is the higher order value systems. So if you'd like to know more, just contact me and we can have a conversation about that, right? But really, this is how I'm going to anchor the rest of my presentation. So as the fourth industrial revolution implies, there were four previous industrial revolutions, but if we're still talking, and if your company is still talking about digitization, if you're still talking about digitalization or digitization as the next driver of your organization, this is the next frontier, this is what we're doing right now, you'll see that you're actually only moving into the third industrial age because it's supported by electronics and information technologies. What does it mean? It means primarily that you're still caught in the second industrial age. You haven't even moved into the third industrial age yet. Never mind the world underpinned by AI and Internet of Things, etc., etc. So if you're still talking about digitization, you better move a lot quicker. But what does this mean, this digitization piece? Well, what does it mean? Fundamentally, let's talk about a case study of perhaps the oldest industry in the world. Now, I didn't say the oldest profession, the oldest industry, and that's the church. So the church realized that they need to digitize it. So, well, how do we change our processes and how do we keep up with the times? And so the Roman Catholics were the first to do this. And they did this in 2001, believe it or not. They released the Roman Catholic app, where you can download this app and it gives you instructions in terms of how to do your Hail Marys and how to do your prayers. And that's an example on the right-hand side over there where you can have this confession. They do say very clearly that you still have to go to Mass and you still have to go to church. And this was in 2001. Shortly thereafter, or maybe not shortly thereafter, 8 years later, the Church of England caught up and they said, well, it's not just about an app nowadays, but now what we have is we've got a digital collection plate that when the traditional collection basket comes across with tithing and you haven't got money, that's not an issue. You can now scan and you can now pay with your phone or your card rather than cash, right? So that's what they did in January 2019. The Vatican then said, well, this is amazing, and so they did something very similar towards the end of the year where they combined IoT and they launched the $110 smart rosary bracelet to attract your prayers. And this really helps you to understand how to pray and to be more in touch with God, right? But this is just an example of what happens when industries start to understand this is how we can use technology. But beyond that, what is this fourth industrial revolution that we keep talking about? And what are some of the technologies that underpin this? Well, it is really the first piece, which is digitization that I just spoke to you about, right? But perhaps the poster child of the fourth industrial revolution is artificial intelligence. And Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, said it best. He said, AI is more profound than fire. And to understand that, we need to understand where AI is. Now, I know that there's some of you who are much more up to date and certainly much more adept at artificial intelligence than I am. But for the layman, here's a quick primer. Artificial intelligence can be broken into three realms. The first is what's called narrow artificial intelligence, which is essentially a series and a whole bunch of embedded loops. It's a whole bunch of if this then that loops, maybe a couple of while statements, but primarily it's about saying if you meet this condition, then here's an outcome. So for example, if you were to say, okay, Craig, how tall was Barack Obama? That's the question, that's the if, that question is asked, then the answer is he is 1.8 odd meters tall, right? So that's really the piece over there. But it's really not that sophisticated. All of you have used some kind of AI today, whether it's already in your word processor, whether it was using a map to drive somewhere, whether it's to work or home or to the store, or whether it's even something just as simple as saying, well, how do we use email to do autocomplete in our email, right? But there's probably about 98% of the world's artificial intelligence is narrow artificial intelligence. What comes after narrow artificial intelligence is general artificial intelligence, where the machine and artificial intelligence is able to take knowledge from one domain and transfer that knowledge to another one. Narrow artificial intelligence can't do that, but general can. So in a world of artificial general intelligence, it has the ability to understand the context of where you're going and apply prior learning to that realm. The good news is probably about 99% of the world's AI is still narrow artificial intelligence. Only a very few is artificial general intelligence. The thing, though, that has really popularized artificial intelligence is the Hollywood effect. This is where Hollywood has said, there's going to be a machine that's smarter than the sum of all of us, and that's the Terminator situation, that's the Skynet situation, where one machine is smarter than the sum of all of us put together, right? The question is, how far are we from super artificial intelligence? Well, depending on who you ask, the experts say, well, even just general artificial intelligence, we're anything between 10 and 15 years away, but we don't know. The problem is, from general AI to super AI, maybe a matter of hours, maybe minutes, or maybe even seconds, right? But don't worry about that. The trick is, fundamentally today, most artificial intelligence is in the realm of narrow artificial intelligence, but some shifting over to artificial general intelligence, like DeepMind, that can now apply learned knowledge to complete novel tasks. One of those things was essentially playing StarCraft. Now, if you've ever played StarCraft, it's essentially two teams and they have to complete some kind of task, whether it's about killing the other team or it's about capturing a flag equivalent or some version thereof. And what DeepMind was able to do is they found that when you play DeepMind as a computer, as a machine, against human-only players, the machine will win 99.8% of the time. Basically, every single time, if a machine-only team will always beat a human-only team. But what they found was, if you combine a human and a machine team, this mixed term, this hybrid team, will essentially win more often than not, right? And that's part of those values first that I spoke about that I'm not going to be talking about in this presentation. Okay? But why is this so pivotal? Well, there's this guy called Lee Sedol, and he basically said, well, he's going to quit a game called Go, which is essentially a very sophisticated form of chess that they play in Asia, but it's much more than that. But the long and short of it is, he essentially quit because he said he cannot keep up with AI, and he retired. So that's artificial intelligence. What next? Well, blockchain. And we all perhaps have heard about Bitcoin, the cryptocurrency that has gone through these ups and downs, a high of 60-odd thousand, 50,000, then down to 30, and now hovering approximately around about the $40,000 mark. But the protocol on which Bitcoin runs is called blockchain, and I'm not going to go through it specifically. Suffice to say, it's a distributed open source ledger. Distributed, which means all part of the chain can see it. Open source, so anyone can see it. And it's a ledger because it records transactions, debits and credits, and then you're able to then reconcile everything together. But let me talk about another example. This example is about mangoes, because there was a set of mangoes in Walmart in the US, and this story is very interesting because Walmart had an issue, right? The issue was that these mangoes that they found had salmonella in them. And the head of quality control walked into the boardroom one day and he threw the box of mangoes on the table and said, this is a problem. We've got these mangoes that have got salmonella and it's causing food poisoning for a lot of our customers. Please track where this comes from. Now, if you think about this, it's an exceptionally difficult problem because you have to understand which mangrove, what kind of water, which kind of pesticide was used. Maybe there was a contracting company, they cut it down. Who was that company? Where did it go for cold storage? Where did it go for distribution? Where did it then go to be distributed? Who manages the logistics? Who then stocked it? Which shopping centers? Which stores? It's a very complicated problem. But their team were able to work out that it took them 6 days, 18 hours and 26 minutes to eventually track where this mangrove came from. They took all this information on this entire value chain, put it onto the blockchain, and they were then able to automate this and determine where those mangoes would come from within 2 seconds. And the exponential gains of this are absolutely astounding because you can now see where every single part of the chain is. Yes, the flip side of that is every part of your value chain needs to subscribe to the blockchain, but the power is still there to understand that it's all recorded in this distributed open source ledger. Okay? The third technology that I like to chat about is quantum computing. And quantum computing is essentially leveraging off Moore's law, which is doubling the processing speed and half the transistors and half the size. But how am I going to explain this to you? Well, let's start with this. If I have a coin and I were to flip a coin, your coin has one or two states. It's either heads or tails. That's how classical computers today work. It's either on or off. The transistor's either on or off. There's either current or there's not. But it's essentially one or two states on and off. But if I were to take a coin and I were to flip it, the moment it's spinning in the air, it's not 1 or 0, it's not heads or tails, it's both heads and tails at exactly the same time. And this is one of the principles that quantum computers operate on. Because this is the proposition called superposition, right, where it's both heads and tails at exactly the same time. But if I were to flip not 1, but 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 or even a million coins, what would happen is then one of the outcomes of those coins can then change the outcome of another coin. But not only that, they exhibit something called entanglement, where they can then change the outcome without even being the same physical proximity. Now, at this point in time, you should be saying to yourself, I have no idea what Craig's talking about, and that's right. So let me give you an example over here. Okay, here's an example. If you were in a maze, so if you were walking in a maze, okay, you would start walking somewhere, and as soon as you went around, you'd come back to the same starting position, and you'd start again. You'd walk somewhere else, you'd go around the maze, and you'd come back to the same starting position. That's how today's traditional computers work, because it's very much a series process. It's doing one then the other then the other. But theoretically, if I could take myself and then make 1,000 copies of myself, 10,000 copies of myself, each one of these different versions of Craig would walk through this maze, and as soon as I found the exit, they would recombine into one Craig again. Now, why is it so important? Because it's essentially supercomputers on steroids. What I mean by supercomputers on steroids? Well, this is exactly what Google claims. Google says that their quantum computer can do the impossible in 200 seconds. What's the impossible? It's what they say today supercomputers can do in 30 years, right? And if you think about what that means fundamentally, is we have now mass amount of computing power to do crazy things like new material engineering. It's able to understand new kind of chemical compositions, and I might say, well, how do we come up with new medication? If we had quantum computing, we probably could have come up with some kind of vaccine for COVID much sooner. But beyond that, it's stuff like we can now model out accurately the cause and effect of climate change. We can now determine what are the effects on one part of an ecosystem as opposed to another part of the ecosystem. And we can probably start to do some crazy things like even, dare I say it, crack Bitcoin and the blockchain itself, right? And it's not just Google, it's now IBM as well. But a lot of different companies are now working in this realm of quantum computing. So those are 3 technologies that I think are going to be very important that are changing the world today. And these ones will be big ones to watch out for today if they have not already started affecting your business, right? So the next is businesses. And underpinned by all this technology, as I said before, is the third industrial age, which is primarily around digitization. Now, the number of years it took to reach 50 million users, it took airlines 68 years, automobiles 62 years, telephones 50 years, electricity 46 years, credit cards 28 years, and televisions 22 years. Now, that top line is pre-internet, it's pre-digital, right? And you can see this is all 20 years plus. But as soon as digital started to come through, it took 18 years for ATMs, 14 years for computers, cell phones 12 years, internet 7 years, and iPods 4 years to reach 50 million users. Now, the more astute you would say, yes, but the population numbers are growing, but not at the same rate of exponential increase that we can see over here. So this is the first wave of digitization. But then we start seeing platforms and we start seeing social media. And in this world, it took 4 years for YouTube to reach 50 million users, Facebook 3 years, Twitter 2 years, and Pokemon Go just 19 days. And some of you listening on this today may not even know what Pokemon Go is. Well, it's really a game that you download onto your phone, and from here it's augmented reality, and you swipe and you catch Pokemon, right? But what's interesting is out of this sprung new kinds of business models, because it was a bank called Spear Bank in Russia that realized that people were walking around playing this game, and they were walking over bridges, they were walking into traffic, and so they said, what we can do is we can offer real-time insurance. So even some companies are starting to say, well, how do we change the way in which we do business, right? So the world of business is fundamentally being changed because of technology. But let's take a step back. Think for a second, perhaps you've had a child that's under the age of 2, perhaps you've got a nephew or niece or a grandson or a granddaughter. But if you give a child an iPad or an iPhone or some kind of piece of technology, they start doing this immediately, they start swiping, right? In fact, today, as a thank you for doing my PhD research, this presentation would not be possible without one thing. And what's that? It's connectivity. And so connectivity drives everything. And so a child being born today expects to be connected from day one. They expect everything that they know and every single piece of information flows as part of their life to be online. And what that means is things are faster and things are more transparent, much like that example that I shared with you, Craig 1 and Craig 1 2. So if you're a child being born today, this is what your world may be like.
Push, push.
so the generation today is really born for the internet. So it's a little bit of fun and games. But just think about what this means. It means that, we need to ensure that we cater for this new kind of need, right? In fact, the United Nations declares that connectivity is now a human basic need. But what about the world of business? Because this is that section. Well, the biggest YouTube earner last year was a young kid called Ryan Kaji. And he made $29.5 million on YouTube. He made $29.5 million, and what was he doing? He was unwrapping and he was opening gifts. He was opening up toys. That's how much he made. The crazy thing is, it wasn't just that he made $30 million, approximately $30 million, earning on YouTube. He also made a further $200 million from branded toys and clothing. And so the world has now changed to the world of influencers, and folks are now making huge amounts of revenue and huge amounts of money by understanding how to capitalize on this wave of digitization. But what does this mean primarily for more other businesses, right? And for that, we turn to something called the 60s of exponential economy that Peter Diamandis spoke about. And for that, I'm going to use the example of Airbnb, right? So if you think back to the old days before the internet, how would you book a hotel room? And some of you may not know this because you're not old enough. But primarily what would happen is you'd get a brochure in the post, snail mail, and you'd open the brochure and you'd go through it and you'd say, oh, here's a lovely place that I'd like to go stay. And then you would either phone them via using a dial-up number. Depending on your age, you'd either do this or this, right? But fundamentally you do that, or maybe even fax them, right? But because of digitization, because of the internet and connectivity, all of that information flows becomes a series of ones and zeros. If it's ones and zeros, I can then turn it into an app, and I then carry the booking platform on the phone with me. So it becomes digitized. The next thing that happens is very deceptive, because if you use Airbnb and you try to explain this to someone maybe 5-10 years ago, maybe even now today, you try to explain it to your parents or your grandparents or maybe even yourself, right? It's very deceptive because it doesn't seem like a good idea. Why would you want to go to somewhere? Why would you want to go to Paris potentially and then stay in someone's house that you've never met? Why would you want to open up your own house here and say, well, I've got a spare bedroom and some stranger come stay with me? It's very, very deceptive. But then it becomes exceptionally disruptive. And why? Because the traditional hotels, the ones that usually had the monopoly around hospitality, now start seeing occupancy rates of about 60-70% pre-COVID times. But they know that there's people in the cities because they can see them at the beaches and the shopping centers, right? So it becomes very disruptive. The next thing that happens is money gets taken out of the system. Because of the digitization effect, the money flows, the payment flows now becomes part of the app, and you simply just click the button to do the payments. Finally, secondly, it becomes dematerialized. Because if you use Airbnb, you don't care about the concierge, you don't care about the check-in desk. What you care about is you care about a great location, a bed and a shower, right? And so for all intents and purposes, everything else disappears. And finally, it becomes democratized. Now, anyone can rent out the room and anyone can rent out the room, right? Don't believe me? Here's a picture of Krakow in Poland. The blue dots are where you can stay at a traditional hotel. The red dots are where you can stay at an Airbnb. There's two things that you'll notice. The first one is the obvious one. There's so much more choice for you. There's so much more choice for you to stay at an Airbnb. But the second thing you'll notice is the concentration of the Airbnbs is very much in the center of Krakow. This is traditionally where the hotspots are. This is traditionally where, this is where the hotels are. This is where the nightlife is. This is where the shopping is. This is where the clubs and bars are, right? So that's where the high life is. And Airbnb allows you to be in the center of town versus some of the hotels which pay for accommodation. They can get real estate somewhere else. Brian Chesky then said this. He said this 7.5 years ago. He said, Marriott wants to add 30,000 rooms this year. We will add in the next 2 weeks. Why is he able to do that? Because of the 60s, because of this platform economics piece. Essentially, think about how important, how powerful the statement is. If Marriott wants to add 30,000 rooms, they first have to find the land. Then they have to do the site inspection. Then they have to get approval. After they get the approval, then they have to get the contractors and they have to build it. They have to then say, well, how do we ensure that there's infrastructure, there's water, there's electricity. After the hotel's built, it has to be kitted out. It has to be interior design. They have to market it, right? That process may take you maybe 2 years to do if you're lucky, right? But what's Brian Chesky and Airbnb able to do? Just by turning on a switch, by activating a new region, by activating a new country or new city, they can bring 30,000 rooms on in the next 2 weeks. And that's the power of exponentials. And this power of exponentials, this whole thing around 60s and platform economics that I just showed you, the 60s, is not just Airbnb and hotels. It's the same thing that happened with Ubers and taxis, and it's likely, and it's the same thing that happened with music and YouTube, and it's likely what's happening in the finance sector right now. Think about the finance sector and think about all these fintech startups. It's also likely, in fact, it's going to happen already in energy in South Africa. Think about distributed energy and solar, where it's already following a version of the 60s. So the 6D effects is very much apparent in almost all businesses today. Right? Because it's a world beyond collaboration where the largest software vendors don't write apps The most popular media owners create no content, retailers have no stock, companies have no taxis, accommodation providers have no real estate, phone companies have no telecoms infrastructure, and the largest movie house has no cinemas. It's all about access over ownership, and in South Africa, the biggest electricity provider has no electricity. But really, it's all about understanding how we need access to stuff, right? And it's about the access to the right, not ownership of the car, for argument's sake. That's so important, right? What does this all mean if you combine it all together, if we take some of the technology stuff and some of the business stuff? Well, we have a company that's operating today in 2021 that's almost like the future. And this company is Alibaba. So if you think about it, the 14th of February is Valentine's Day, right? That's the day when you buy something for your loved one. But in China, because of one-child policy and cultural norms, the biggest demographic is single men. And therefore, in China, Jack Ma and Alibaba said, as I said, well, on the 14th of February, because no one loves you and you're hideous and you're all by yourself, don't wait for the 14th of February to buy yourself. Buy something on the 11th of November, 1111, all the singles or branches on a tree, right? And they said, buy something for yourself on this day. So the Chinese did. And in 2020, last year, they had bought $74.1 billion worth of goods, an increase of 93% within 24 hours. They had almost 3 billion orders in 24 hours. The first billion was hit in 68 seconds, 2 billion in 2 minutes. In 30 minutes, they had surpassed the equivalent of Singapore's 2019 GDP. They had 583,000 peak orders per second. The first order was delivered in 11 minutes, and 5 billion parcels through customs under 5 hours, 93% delivered in under 24 hours. Not just that, Katy Perry was the headline performer. They had 260,000 payments per second, but they shipped 1 billion packages from 250,000 brands and merchants from 230 regions and 84 countries, including Maseratis, Jaguars and BMWs, and Alibaba provided the vehicle finance. Think about that. That means an e-commerce provider that usually sells little widgets and little things is now able to provide finance, and they're now starting to move into the finance space. But they also then worked in the ecosystem and upgraded 600,000 computers to build an ecosystem that would support this very day. Okay, and finally, a day in China is now bigger than a whole year's online sales in Brazil. I went back and I did some research and I said, let's have a look at the 10 biggest retailers in South Africa. And when you look at the 10 biggest retailers in South Africa combined by revenue, they don't even make up 60% of how much Alibaba made up in one day. Still not convinced how much Alibaba made in 24 hours was the same as 21% of South Africa's GDP. 21% of South Africa's GDP within 24 hours. And just think for a second what that would mean if we're able to create a singles day moment. That's the power when you understand the technology stack and the business interfaces that I've just explained to you right now. And if you're amazed at what I've presented to you today, think about this. William Gibson, the author, says, the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. The future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. Right? So all these examples that I've shared with you are all things that are already apparent. And it's really up to you to carry on thinking about this and saying, well, how do we now contribute to ensure that we think about our future differently? Because as Mike Tyson quote shows you, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Right? So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I've enjoyed sharing this with you. And again, as a thank you so much for being part of my PhD research. I really do appreciate the time. Please do keep in contact with me. You can see there's my contact details at the bottom over there, whether it's my website, www.craigbin.com, or feel free to email me, craig@craigbin.com, and then there's my telephone number. You can follow me on Twitter at wingnuts123. Again, thank you so much for being part of my research. I really do appreciate your help, and hopefully I will chat to you at some stage in the future. Thank you very much.